Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a privilege to introduce our author today. I'm Peter Bergen. I run the International Security Program here, and we're about to get started. So Dr. Mohammed Fraser-Rahim is the Executive Director of North America, Quilliam International. And he'll also, in addition to talking about his new book, America's Other Muslims, Imam W.D. Mohammed, Islamic Reform and the Making of American Islam, he will also probably explain a little bit about what Quilliam does, because Quilliam is a very well-known organization in the United Kingdom, maybe a little less well-known here. He's also teaches at the Citadel, I just found out, which is a kind of a interesting extra, and also teaches at Yale. So we're delighted that you are here and that you will talk about your book for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to a conversation.
Great. So thank you, Peter. And I want to say congratulations for your book too as well. I mean, just and I've been following you on CNN too as well. And thanks for your commentary. It's an honor to be here. And this is the first event that I'm having since the book came out on Friday. So New America actually over a year ago hosted myself and Yahya Fanusi, where over a year ago, I should say, on a report we did on African-American recruitment to violent extremism. And it was very timely that we had that event. So it's very, very, very important. I see a lot of friends here too as well. I have to acknowledge my friend David Priest, who I think is very important to acknowledge him, who is an excellent author and writer himself, but also who taught me how to write the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief. And I have to acknowledge him because I was maybe a bit of a exuberant, slightly arrogant analyst at the time. He probably disagrees, but I think I was. And he taught me a lot, and I appreciate that. So I wanted to acknowledge his presence here as well as other friends. So what I wanted to do is just dive in. I mean, this body of work really continues from, I did my PhD at Howard University under the late Dr. Suleiman Yang, who is probably considered the dean of Islamic thought in America in terms of his contribution. I see Ethelbert Miller too as well, who I engage with on a regular occasions at Howard, and I want to thank him as well. But Dr. Yang himself was able to really help shape a lot of the perspectives, and I think a very nuanced fashion, on the history and the evolution of African American Muslims and Islam in America. And so I tee up, and using my government language too as well, and to frame the conversation of Dr. Yang's perspective has been instrumental toward the discourse of Islam in America as well. This book right here is certainly overpriced. As an academic body of work, I want to put that out. But I think it's also very important to highlight that the book itself captures two things. One, it is an academic body of work, but it also is very policy relevant. My work has also been looking at the intersection between policy and scholarly work. And particularly looking at Islam, violent extremism, de-radicalization, and rehabilitation in particular. And so the book itself, I think, highlights and really talks about the evolution. So the first chapter gets into this larger conversation of African-American Muslims, African-American Islam. And despite the current discourse of Islam being foreign, immigrant, new, and outside of not being part of the American fabric, we know, to the contrary, that American Muslims have been in this society since the beginning. Since the arrival, that individuals like Thomas Jefferson, our founding fathers, George Washington themselves, owned enslaved African Muslims who were from here, from West Africa, and they brought with them a very pragmatic form of Islam. And so that evolution is important. I also highlight, and it's important to notate, is that the first play of Islam in America was conducted, was a play about Mohammed the Prophet by the very famous writer, thinker, Voltaire. And Voltaire did a play, and the first arrival of this play into America was titled Mohammed the Imposter. And it was showcased in 1742 in Baltimore, Maryland, October 1st, and then another showing in October 15th, which is very interesting that, the first play by Voltaire was the fanatisme ou Mohammed the Prophet. It was him being a fanatic, and then once it came into the English, it became Mohammed the Imposter. In the 18th century, one of the slurs at the time to call anyone, particularly, would be called a Muslim. So just that evolution in terms of Islam being in the United States for quite some time. We know certainly the legacy right here in Washington, D.C. of Yaro Mahmoud, who arrives in 1752. I was involved in an effort with the DC Archaeological Project, where we were able to look and we were searching for his grave. Unfortunately, we're not able to find it. And something that's taking place in May this year is that of an opera, the first opera, continuing from the work of Voltaire, if you will, but in a more positive light, that will be showcased in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Spoleto Festival, titled Omar, of Omar ibn Said. And so this is the first opera that will be performed at the Spoleto Festival, and I've been advising them on this. So I think, the beginning of this of this book, this chapter 1, highlights this evolution of Islam in America, having foundational roots. The Islamic identity that was brought here by these enslaved Africans was much, much more that of pragmatism, that of a spirituality, that of a negotiation of Islam. I highlight in the book the role of Islamic mysticism, oftentimes characterized loosely as Sufism or Tasawwuf, that was certainly the pervasive Islam in the society. Many scholars would probably estimate and actually probably argue that the Islam coming from West Africa, the Islamic origins and roots, had with them a technical sophistication that many throughout the Arab and Islamic world would know, meaning there's certain liturgical traditions, certain texts that are read, certain body of works. And so, as you can imagine, the first wave of enslaved Africans, when they come into the United States, they're bringing those technical skills. I always highlight that, Professor Usman Khan at Harvard University highlights this as well, is that the center of Islamic gravity wasn't just in the Arab Islamic world, but also in West Africa. And so this deep sense of learning and scholarship isn't Timbuktu is this dusty place, but one of learning. The very famous poet, Sheikh Amadou Bamba Mbeki, a very popular Senegalese mystic, says, I no longer need Baghdad nor Fez. Upon seeing Jollof, I submitted. And I think that that's a very timely sort of capture of which will segue into the African-American experience coming into the New World of Baghdad or Fez, certainly a place of high Islamic intellectual learning. Historically, we know the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, but that learning, West African Muslims were able to engage in Islam on their own terms. And so then we move forward and just in capturing into the next chapters, we look at West Africa, Islamic revivalism. And I think that's important just for the sake of time. When we talk about Islamic revivalism in West Africa, that many of the West African Muslims and thinkers also were living in societies that were multi-religious, multi-ethnic. Al-Hajj Salim Sarari, very famous in the 15th century, was encouraging and trying to find ways to respect the rights of Muslims or non-Muslims in Muslim majority nations. So what I would characterize the early versions of interfaith dialogue in West African society. So you can imagine that that was certainly important as these Islamic communities or individuals, some of the very famous ones that I highlight in the book, Omar ibn Said, Yaro Mahmoud, Ibrahim Abdurrahman, the Prince Among Slaves, very well-known story that PBS did a documentary on, are just a few of those personalities who are coming with those traditions as they've come to the New World. To make a long story short, but to capture the sort of succinct points, many scholars estimate that there was this gap, right, between African Islam, all that liturgical tradition that I've highlighted, that the body of knowledge that was passed down, leaving the Arabian Peninsula from the 7th century onward, and that continuity of knowledge, and then this gap, 40 to 60 years between African Islam and African American Islam. It's a really important sort of historical moment to recognize this distinction between African Islam and that tradition, and then African American Islam. What is African American Islam? Oftentimes, I think a lot of scholars have highlighted this proto-Islamic. To simplify it, I like using terms like Islamic hybrid movements, because I think hybridity shows a level of negotiation of identity, negotiation of place, negotiation of what's to come. And so these hybrid movements came in the form of what we certainly are knowing in the US context, movements like the Moorish Science Temple, movements like the Nation of Islam. I think it's also important to highlight, with the unfortunate attacks that we saw just last year of the Hanukkah attack, and also in Jersey City of Black Hebrews, individuals have asked the question, who are the Black Hebrews, right? The same question can come up, who are the Black Muslims, right? They are not a monolith. The Black Hebrew communities, like many other African-American communities, were looking and have been searching for meaning and purpose. So not all African-Americans are Christians. Certainly that has been, in light of being on enslaved plantations or being on plantations in the American South, the forced conversion, and then as you can imagine, the decision to then leave that religion that certainly was imposed on them by the slave masters of pick your location in the American South, including in Maryland and Virginia. And so I think this is important to highlight this sort of space of where enslaved African Muslims have been struggling or the evolution, or I should say, of these communities as well. So that gap has taken place. We have, and I should say, I'm sorry, the Black Hebrew movements also were another expression of African Americans looking for religious and spiritual identity. And so you have a whole body of knowledge, though the book doesn't get into this, of Black Jewry, if you will, Black Judaism, that followed some Orthodox strains, and then others who were going through what I call a hybridity, just like you had African American Islam, right? And so this is important because the Nation of Islam was one expression, but there were also Black Sunni movements that were happening adjacent, much smaller in number as well. Looking at this issue and having worked in government spaces, I remember several times trying to explain sort of Nation of Islam in sort of policy terms too as well. I characterize more of a social sort of cultural movement that certainly had some elements of theological embedding, nationalism, and including into that. And I think that's important to highlight, right, in terms of how the Nation of Islam as a movement, as a community has evolved, and what has come next. Speed up time in simplifying very complex history in one particular book. I would say that two events that aren't highlighted as much, but I think certainly changes the space of what we know Islam in America. One, we have 1975, where you have the legacy of the Nation of Islam and those Black power movements that were developing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. You had the death of the Nation of Islam leader. And then you also had the son of Elijah Muhammad, Orsi Muhammad, who took the mantle and became the leader of this ancestral community. Clearly, we know that's gone in two different directions. Louis Farrakhan, which I don't even engage with him in this particular book, because I think that's a whole separate direction that this could have gone into, and that policy report that we did kind of captures it a little bit. But what I would say is 1975, when W.D. Muhammad takes the mantle, becomes the leader of the indigenous foundational Muslim community, which he takes into a whole nother direction, which I'll get into in 1 minute. Also, 1964 is not highlighted enough. What's 1964? It's the Civil Rights Act. We also have the Hart-Sellers Act, right, in 1965, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act, which brought massive waves of immigrants from the broader Muslim world. Prior to that, there's quota systems that were put in place. So I don't think that that's captured enough, and I think the book puts this, in the context that the role of the 1964 Civil Rights Act had a huge impact in allowing large waves of Muslims coming from the broader Muslim world into the United States. That's not dismissing and highlighting the wealth and large tradition we know in Dearborn, Michigan. We know Syrian Arab communities that have been in the United States. We know Albanian communities. We go to Iowa. We go up north into the Northeast. There were certainly concentrations, but when we're talking about large amounts of immigrants coming from the Arab world, highly technical skilled jobs coming into that, I think the 1964 is not giving us the credit enough for what it meant toward also bringing large waves of American Muslims Muslims into the US, which then brought the ascendancy to the Muslim Student Association, et cetera. Chapter 3, I think chapter 3, I have to just look down just to remember the chapters, but chapter 3, and I think it's chapter 4, actually, excuse me, chapter 4 really, I think, highlights the importance of, and particularly that 1975 moment that I was mentioning. W.D. Mohammed was excommunicated at least 3 times from this community, the ancestral community, because he rejected his father's teachings of nationalism, of division, if you will, and radically challenged it, and spent different times traveling abroad, including in Syria, and also being right in the United States, and challenging his father's theological perspectives. You can imagine the internal conversation that had within the community itself, one that was highly centralized, highly controlled, based in Chicago, and him resisting with all the trappings, financial and as well as status, and deciding to move this community that now has given rise to over 300 plus mosques throughout the United States. It is certainly, if not the largest, one of the largest Muslim communities and associations throughout the United States. This community has evolved, and it has, including right here in Washington, D.C., Masjid Mohammed, which is seen as one of the flagship mosques that's standing. But I think what W.D. Mohammed, and I capture in the book, and I'm a bit forward-leaning, I call him the patron saint of American Islam, because I think sainthood is this idea of, and particularly oftentimes Muslim communities debate this idea. There's no saints in Islam, and and this is borrowing from Catholic traditions. But I think sainthood is this idea of this person who brings honor, respect, a stature of dignity, and I think in many respects his ability to bring this massive waves of American Muslims who previously were radicalized in some shape or fashion, and having very divisive perspectives, some real and or imagined, some legitimate against the state, and channeling this means to say, you have to be productive members of the society, dismantling their old ideology. We've heard this, think about overseas, dismantling the theology, dismantling and including and encouraging a healthy sense of patriotism, a healthy sense of identity, where the community has been able to have the first American judges in the United States come from this community. The first American mayors come from this community. The first American congressmen come from this community too as well. And Andre Carson being that sort of particular position of being a member of this community as well. So I think that this is important to highlight the legacy of what W.D. Mohammed offers, and then him boldly challenging what I would call the status quo of American Islam, or what would be challenged is say, hey, you have to give your loyalty and you have to give your affiliation, you have to give your allegiances to overseas entities of Islam. And him taking a pretty bold position to say, you know what, we need to do things independently on our own terms, and we can be both American and Muslim. And so what you see right here, and I corrected this with the publisher because they got it slightly wrong on the back, but this picture right here is at Mosque Miriam, which is the ancestral mosque in Chicago, where Louis Farrakhan still has inherited this, but Imam W.D. Mohammed picks up this flag, an American flag, which is like, wow, who would do this at this time? And now we have communities who are now said, well, we need to be both American and Muslim. We know that certainly individuals like Muhammad Ali was able to KO the idea of being both American and Muslim, and has been able to champion this cause. So I think this is important to highlight the role of W.D. Mohammed and his ability to create independent thinking for American Muslims who could easily have decided to say, you know what, let's become African Muslims again. Let's come up with an imagined view of the past, of our African ancestry, and let's start putting on clothing and outfits and ideas and subscribe to a particular school of Islamic thought. The vast majority of Muslims throughout the world usually would say that they subscribe to one of the 4 major schools of Sunni thought, and certainly we know within the Shia traditions, having a number of Islamic thoughts and schools of legal thoughts as well. W.D. Mohammed says, guess what? This is certainly important. This is helpful. And I highlight it in the book, but he says, we also need to recognize the time-space reality of where we are in the United States. And though you might not be comfortable as calling it a madhab, a school of thought, which is, shh, don't say this, we need to start considering American, and for my European counterparts, a Western school of Islamic thinking. So this is pretty courageous. And we're talking about 1975, 1976, a form of Islamic revivalism, Islamic renewal that builds off of the tradition of the past, which I highlighted, but also clearly mentioning and highlighting and stepping out on his own. I mean, you have to imagine at the time that the Islamic communities that were coming here were certainly weren't always comfortable with this position that W.D. Mohammed took and his particular position to do this on his own. I think that there was, I think on the other side of this, and I'll wrap up in a few minutes, is that you also have W.D. Mohammed recognizing that the community also slowly, it took time to transition. We're talking about, at least various estimates, but let's just say 1 million followers at the time, and sympathizers to say, let's get rid of, let's move away from just these teachings of the white man is the devil and various frames of how they saw the world. And not everyone was able to make the transition. And so that I think that's important to highlight, is that this struggle with even himself, and you can see this in his body of work. I've analyzed his work and have a library at home of a lot of his thinking and his tapes and his literature. And I think he wrestled with that, I think at various times, admonishing even his own community to say, you know what, you all, I'm here for you. I want to see you successful, but there's a certain level of a baseline knowledge that also has to be engaged with to make sure that you are, if you're going to be able to engage with your counterparts and throughout the Muslim world, you have to be conversant as well on basic Arabic, basic Islamic ideas and terminology as well. So I think there was this struggle too as well to balance that out, and you can see that within his writings. I think he also recognized quickly that the next generation, younger generation, were also part of the future. And so there was various efforts to send overseas students, young students at various ages, teenagers, I would say, onwards. I think the range was between 13 and 20, early 20s, where they were able to be recipients and study, including in Damascus, Syria, and Malaysia. There was a formal partnership with the late Grand Mufti of Syria. Damascus is clearly no more, but this engagement of students who were becoming conversant in Arabic language, and they were able to engage. I think one of the most important things is, I think, interviewing and talking with some of those students, they would say that our job was to go to the Arab world to get the technical knowledge, but not to become Arab or not to become something other than who they were. Last thing I'll say, and just to close out, particularly the chapter 5 of brother, I think I call it Brother Imam. There's a various language terminology that was used internally in the community. So this was a play on the desire by the late Imam W.D. Mohammed, who died in 2008, to call the community imams would call him Brother Imam, more as a sort of an endearment, respect, to say I'm also equal to you, but I'm not bigger than you as well. So a level of respect and engagement, I think that's quite interesting. So I titled that Brother Imam. So the lessons, putting on my policy hat, I'm the executive director for Quilliam, which is the oldest counter-extremism think tank in the world. We're composed of former extremists, and clearly I am not a former. I worked in U.S. intelligence, working on counterterrorism issues and working on, providing analysis for various presidents, and so I've always taken a very nonpartisan approach, working for various administrations. But Quilliam, particularly as we've worked throughout the world, and particularly comprised of formers themselves, that is important in terms of being able to talk about what tools are effective to combat extremism. This book, and particularly the formula, what I highlight is this community offers at least a 44-year counter-radicalization program. Now, I framed it that way because I think what we're all throughout the world, I'm constantly being asked, different programs, what program is working? Is countering violent extremism a surveillance effort? Is countering violent extremism working with the establishment? Are Muslim communities a monolith in terms of their engagement of working with the state? I mean, this becomes loaded terminology. I mean, I guess in many respects, because I've worked in government, I've seen it from all sides of the angles, and I see a few former government folks. I mean, being in government, it feels very much like in a policy think tank too as well. There's different perspectives. You're wrestling through ideas. There are individuals who are medical doctors, others who are historians and theological background. There are those who have background in advertising. So you bring in those perspectives that try to give a nuanced perspective to policymakers who then can make an informed decision. So I teed that up just to say that I understand these issues in a very real world sense. I have, during time in government, I've been to Guantanamo Bay, sat down, engaged with formers themselves. I continue to do that, and right now, both in the United States and throughout the world, I know these issues very well and engaging in that space. So what I highlight, and I think the last chapter, is this idea of that this community offers one particular perspective to consider as we think about within the United States and broader Western societies who are struggling through the idea of, can Muslims be integrated into society? One. Secondly, with the rise of identity politics, what role do Muslims have to play, and is it all or nothing? Is it just law enforcement, what someone might see as you're either aligned with government and government's all bad, or it's not engaging at all? I mean, this black and white perspective, and I enjoy gray zones. I think also in these gems that we see within the W.D. Muhammad community shows that community that had real grievances, I mean, coming from the United States, as the broader African-American story being multi-religious, very socioeconomic backgrounds, community that had legitimate issues and concerns of coming into the society in light of the Middle Passage and enslaved African experience. There is this idea of being able to get past some of these grievances and concerns, and then channeling it in a way through constructive critique, through social engagement, and then saying, we can be both American and Muslim. That takes courage. I think that's not an easy task, particularly in what I would perceive as oftentimes the American Muslim community often seeing the idea of encouraging a singular narrative, a singular voice. And I think the late Shahib Ahmed has a beautiful book called What is Islam? And he talks about this idea of Islam there is no singular idea of the Muslim world. There are many Muslim communities, and that expression of Muslim communities certainly is one expressed in African-American Muslim community, but that is also expressed with the rise of Latino Muslims, who are the fastest growing convert communities. It is white American converts. It is various ideological perspectives. And I think with this book is that what W.D. Muhammad offered, the late Imam W.D. Muhammad offered, is this idea of establishing an indigenous Muslim community, and one that is a moving forward and that is part of the fabric all throughout 50 states. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And that was a brilliant kind of encapsulation of the book. So if you have a comment or a question, you each just make sure that you identify yourself and hit the speaker. And I'm going to ask a quick question to start with, and then we'll go to you. So just give us a sense of how you kind of operationalize Quilliam here in the United States. I mean, I know that some of the work you do is by its nature private and has to be, but like give us a sense of what it is that you do, you yourself personally and the organization.
So the work that we do is threefold. One, we run our mouth on TV. So we show up on TV, and that's certainly good for branding. And that, for example, my phone's been blown up about the ramifications of the attack in London, right? Yeah. They're still interested in what American perspectives are. And though we know that there's the rise of domestic terrorism, is certainly with far right white supremacists, we engage in that space too. And so they're interested. So I think we run our mouth, we talk on TV. We do policy and analysis. I mean, this book certainly contributes to the discourse, but we do analytical work. And then lastly, we do programs and interventions. I think that's a lot of what our work has been done since I opened up our offices in the US, so almost 3 years coming up in April, is we work with government, our US government in particular, where we've done work with State Department, DHS, Department of Homeland Security. We've worked in USAID, various government grants where we supported and implemented efforts to counter extremism throughout the world. Now, that could be in the effort of working with individuals who are formers themselves and establishing a network to make sure that how do you integrate them back into society? How will the families, how will the community embrace them? You have to come up with structures and set that in place. We also have programs where we work one-on-one with individuals. So we work with the real tough issue, though a lot of people are not comfortable in doing it because it takes time. And I would love to inoculate using a vaccine. The hard work of sitting and talking to people and working with individuals, both in the United States, which we're doing quietly, and it's not just Islamists, the far right. We now have Black Hebrews, we have Black nationalists. And I think that's important to highlight. I think whatever people's perspective might be, this is a full spectrum. It has always been a full spectrum. Individuals, and I think it's important to have robust criticism and perspective, how those strategies are employed and engaged. But our work has been really in the nitty-gritty effort on de-radicalization, I should say, the DDR, as we say, disengagement, de-radicalization, and rehabilitation.
Well, just to follow up on that, I mean, do you think the government, and the government's obviously a lot of different entities, but I mean, is just US law enforcement more sympathetic to the idea that it shouldn't just be like, if somebody's radicalizing, we're going to put them away for 20 years for material support? Are they more willing to take risks about, because obviously law enforcement generally doesn't want to take a risk, but are they more willing today than they might have been, let's say 10 years ago, to kind of get you or people like you in this space to kind of, whether it's on the far right or Islamist or whatever, do you see a bit greater willingness?
Yes, I think that there is. I mean, law enforcement is learning too as well. And law enforcement isn't just FBI. Law enforcement is, state and local, right? And people forget this. How about the neighborhood, Prince George's County or in Charleston, South Carolina, or down in, Seminole County down in Florida? They have concerns. Someone calls and says, there's this kid who's acting wacky. This kid is watching jihadist messages. This kid is watching, Proud Boys, white supremacists. This guy's on Telegram. So it doesn't always get raised up to the level of just Big Brother, FBI. These are state and locals who need assistance, and communities themselves. Muslims are just, are one particular community, but there are many different communities that have concerns and issues. So I think, yes, I think that and I'm giving you the full range from my experience working this issue, that the state, local, and at the federal level, I think there's much more interest. They realize to solve this requires very nuanced approaches. Now, has legislation matched up with that? No. There's not a clear domestic rehabilitation program in the United States. I know Senator Ben Cardin in Maryland has been working aggressively on that, and his staffers have been excellent in this effort. But and Mary McCord at Georgetown has done phenomenal work with Lawfare Blog to really engage on this issue, and a seasoned DOJ, Department of Justice, hand in this. So we need to match up political will, getting the legislative branch, and then also communities. We joke and say, but see something, say something isn't just something that Amtrak is doing. This is real efforts. And, I don't want, the concerns that are being addressed can't just be when Muslim communities are under attack. It has to be on a whole societal issue. I've said this when I've been in Trinidad and Tobago, and they've had the largest per capita number of foreign fighters who were traveling to the so-called Islamic State. I've said this when I've been in Maldives, who had the highest amount of foreign fighters throughout the world. This is a bipartisan issue. It should stay a bipartisan issue. Communities should engage. Yes, they should be critical of the state. They should engage. That's what we have as part of it. But I think we have to find a way of balance. I think this is a slow process. This isn't overnight. The Brits have done, the channel program has been an interesting experiment, but we certainly have seen people game the system. Yeah. I mean, Usman Khan, I brought up earlier briefly, he's one example. And I think there will be many others game the system. What I always say is this, and it's easy to say we de-radicalize. Mohammed Khalid is one individual in the United States I've personally worked with, and his story is great. And there's probably at least 10, 15 more that we're working with who, they're not in the process to be a Khalid, right? Because guess what? Human beings take time. They regress back. They fall back into behavior because they're human beings. And so if you're looking for a quick solution, this is not the business that I decided to work in. To do. And when I tell my students and cadets at the Citadel, I tell them as well, say, listen, are you in this for the long haul? And I think that's important to highlight. I also use softer language like, we help people on their journey. Yes, academicians and policymakers, we can talk about de-radicalization in a certain, but softer language helps, just to understand that human beings need just different levels of support, just like gang and drug activity as well. Gentlemen.
Ethelbert Miller, writer. Congratulations on your book. Just two short questions. One, when you talk about 1975, did Akbar Muhammad have any sort of mentoring on W.D. Muhammad? And the second question is the influence of Gaddafi in Libya on the African-American Muslim community.
Good questions. Akbar Muhammad, if we're talking about Akbar Muhammad, his brother, who taught at SUNY Binghamton, was a scholar in his own right. When Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, was in I would say in the heyday of the development of the Nation of Islam, you can imagine there's a conversation that young children have, particularly with their father, in questioning. And Akbar was a recipient of studying at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, one of the center places of Islamic thought. Debatable if anyone studied in Fez, Morocco, in terms of being the oldest Islamic seminary. But Akbar himself was a recipient of studying in that learning. I mean, to be frank with you, I think there were certainly tensions between Akbar and W.D. Muhammad. I think Akbar was trained in classical traditional Islam. This is not to say that W.D. Muhammad was, but Akbar was trained also as an academician later on, and then Akbar also went through what I would consider very structured Islamic learning. He was learning Nahu, Sarf, Balagha. This is Islamic etymology, grammar. He was learning from classical Islamic texts, Qurtubi, very technical knowledge. And I think W.D. Muhammad did not have that same level of engagement, right? And so there were times where they bumped heads, right? I would not say that Akbar and W.D. Muhammad were engaging on a regular basis. Any correspondence? So this is a good question. I mean, there are correspondence between them, I think, and I think that's another dissertation and book, particularly with their engagement with one another. Akbar's wife, I think, is Egyptian too as well, and so he spent a lot of time also, as a trained Islamic scholar. And I think that W.D. Muhammad's position was those are important, but he used the verse in the Quran that says, "The one who created me shall guide me." So a lot of his references were very much that he developed a direct personal relationship with the Quran, that he read scripture and texts. He encouraged ijtihad, independent analytical thinking. He encouraged what I would say an interpretation of Islam that was not just static, that time required a level of how do we read text? How is it having a time-space reality? The second question that you had was Libya, and no direct relationship with, I would say this, I think W.D. Muhammad had many individuals who reached out to him to provide, and I highlight this in the book, financial means. And I think that he had this conversation that was outwardly too as well, in this decision of, should I take foreign money or not? Because particularly you'll see that, Saudi Arabia certainly was one example, but many of the Arab states who offered him means, and I think he realized that there was ties to, if he received that money, he might be beholden to them in a particular agenda. So he was very adamant and careful not to take foreign money because of what the stakes, what that would mean, and also for an emerging community that was coming out of the heels of Black nationalism and Islamic hybrid movements, and wrestling to say, hey, will they find their identity? There's a beautiful picture of a community member in the association who had a rendition of a picture of someone in the community. He had this picture of an African American who's wearing a shalwar kameez, Pakistani background, you'll be familiar with that. Someone else is wearing a Arab imama turban. Someone else is wearing some shoes that looks like they got it from the Salvation Army. And then someone else is wearing a West African kaftan. And then at the very top, the person had a picture, an image of a question mark in the brain and saying, who are they? Do they know themselves? And I think this was part of the commentary coming from the tradition of the late Imam W.D. Mohammed of, questioning who individuals are and trying to make sure these community members were both American and Muslim. And so I think that's absolutely interesting. And I, just to add one final point to this, I think what W.D. Mohammed offered as well as this idea of lived Islam, just like you have lived Christianity or lived Judaism. And I think that's oftentimes not captured enough when we think of, that's probably some work for religious studies professors, that the role of lived Islam and how you live religion and how that's applied as well.
Lady in the back.
Quick question. You said that you have government experience. So I'm interested to know about surveillance programs of the government and the relation of that to Islam and Muslims and the American Muslim experience. Because I think there is a struggle, as you've placed, that does not show signs of disappearing.
Really good question. Her question, I'll just repeat it out loud, is the whole question of surveillance, and particularly within Muslim communities. I think that's a really important question. I'll bring up something that I think is important. We talked about the countering violent extremism programs. And, I think the terminology is a bit, that's a whole separate conversation. But what I will say to you, because I think it could go in another direction, but what I will say to you is Masjid Mohammed, the community, the mosque right here in Washington, D.C., received some of the countering violent extremism grant funding that was awarded under the Obama administration, that under the Trump administration, it was carried out or was executed. And in this particular time, Masjid Mohammed, that comes from this community, decided to take the grant money. You can imagine various Muslim communities, organizations reached out and were privately trying to lobby and say, why would you take this government funding? This is all in the spirit of surveillance, the legacy of all, you can imagine that conversation. I won't go into more details than that. And so Masjid Mohammed's response, and I think that's fair enough to say that the Imam Talib Sharif response was, we're familiar with COINTELPRO. We're familiar with government surveillance. We get the issues that you're saying. Absolutely.
Could you speak to that for a quick minute? What
Yes.
is that program? What was that program?
Okay, so the Department of Homeland Security had a CVE grants that were awarded. And so Masjid Mohammed was a recipient out of many different organizations. Many Muslim, or there were a few Muslim communities that received the grant funding as well.
Oh, the COINTEL?
Oh, I'm sorry. No.
What year was that around? The civil rights?
I'm going to come back to
okay.
that, and then we'll get to what you're saying, just so that we're all in
I think that's
sequential.
an important part.
Absolutely. So the community received the grant funding and decided to take the money because they recognized that they, as African American Muslims, have a legacy of both being African American and Muslim. And so the legacy of COINTELPRO, going back to the 60s, was a program that certainly was part of the US government efforts that, in hindsight, 2020, I think federal government would probably question their activities and engagement on. No question on that, and there's not enough time to even engage on that, so I won't open that out. But the community itself, and particularly the African American Muslim community of the community association with the late Imam W.D. Mohammed, recognized that there were real concerns. But guess what? Law enforcement, and particularly FBI, has used entrapment and that as a tool for the last time I can check, at least 30, 40 years. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Now, I'm just glossing over this and moving through this quickly, just for the sake of that is a law enforcement tool and technique. You can engage Congress, you can engage your elected officials to find ways if that is a concern, and that should be debated in a democratic process. That's fine. and there's means and mechanisms. I think the community decided to say, listen, we recognize it, we've been part of it, and many of our community members live in urban environments where they understand entrapment. But that does not take away, and so trying to debate, say the government's not going to do that or not, that should be done, but the community is also going to take this money because this is taxpayer dollars. So the community decided to take that countering violent extremism money in the spirit of saying, we're also Muslim, and if we don't take this money, which is grant funding, then why shouldn't we take it? Because we have a compelling narrative and we're offering a solution. So there were strategic communications plan that were put in place, that were online, that were challenging the narrative against extremism. And so I just wanted to highlight that because this particular community has a very different position and narrative, and we're talking about a network of over 300 plus mosques, so not just small, has a different narrative than maybe other Muslim community. I've highlighted, and I think it's important in the book too as well, is that there is not a single Muslim community. So though this community has a perspective and position on it, I think it's a legitimate position that should be had. There are other Muslim communities in this space based off of ethnic, cultural lines, geopolitical views of the world that have taken a different posture, that have said it is all or nothing and that government surveillance is what's taking place. I don't think it's that simple, and we can talk more details on that because I can see this is a conversation that can go on and on and on. But what I will just highlight to you is I think that nuance, that level of nuance, specificity has to be had internally in the Muslim community, and that's something that W.D. Mohammed encouraged. The intra-Muslim conversation is not being had. Just as much as we talk about interfaith, the intra-Muslim community is something that I think, quite frankly, is part of some of the challenges in the American Muslim space that has also, caused a lot of fractured positions. And I'm not here to solve that. This book is scoped in a particular direction.
I think to latch on to that also within the government community space, the government agency space, the transparency around the surveillance is something that leadership will now take to, with the absence of that, having seen the extremity.
Point taken.
Other questions, comments?
David Priest from the Lawfare Institute. Two things for you. One, to get back to the book a bit, I'm hoping you can share a little bit about your original research and the balance between archival research and interviews on this topic and how it informed you and what you learned from that research. Secondly, the book, you talk about the relationship between West African Islam and the African-American experience with Islam. And historically, there's been some problem with the receptivity, especially in the Arab Islamic world, of having influence from the African-American Islamic community. It's been a mixed dialogue at best. What about the West African Islamic community? What has been the, if you will, the feedback, the other direction of receptivity to some of the experiences of African-American communities within the Islamic communities in the United States, influencing back to West African experience?
Excellent questions. So my PhD is in history, so I'm a historian by training. So historiography was really the framing of it. I mean, I could have, to be frank with you, I could have gone on and done a mixed method approach, but largely it was historical research, archival research in my approach. And I did that for the sake of time and wanting to get the book out and the ideas. I think that was important, when I am older and, I can sit down, I'll write that other book that's 400 pages. But for now, I wanted the balance between the two, to be honest with you. The second question on, this is interesting. I really like your point on, Malcolm has, so we have all these personalities throughout the world that everyone knows, like Malcolm X. I mean, Malcolm X's autobiography was first translated in Turkish, right? You have all these iconic African-American figures, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, who, even the role of hip hop in Islam, I mean, such a fusion, offshoots of the Nation of Islam, including the 5%ers, which are Islamic hybrid movements, and, some elements of Islam, but some elements of sort of street culture and a subculture as well. That all has had an appropriation. I mean, I think many, not just African-American, but urban communities are familiar with African-American Muslim expression. So I think this is interesting that, you know, someone like a Malcolm X is highlighted as this iconic figure, right? Throughout the world. But, and I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day. He was like, oh, you know, I disagree slightly on this, but the position I think is Malcolm also, when he made his, I think he's highlighted in many nationalist circles, Black nationalist, just nationalist circles as a whole, if you bear with me on that. He is championed as this sort of resistance, as this challenging the state, absolutely. But Malcolm also was not able to get buried in a mosque. We forget this idea. Malcolm had to get, he received his final rites in a church. So this question comes up, where's his Muslim community, right? Who have Arab, and this Muslim idealism, right? Why aren't they coming together? In fact, he has to go to a church to get his final, basically to host him, his final body, and then an individual who was trained from overseas, an African American, gave him his final funeral rites. So it's very interesting, these ideas, these multiple identities that are playing out. Malcolm as the revolutionary, Malcolm X as the social justice champion, Malcolm as post going to Mecca and Medina, and sort of this open UN, United Nations type figure, but also he's not able to even get his final burial rites by his Muslim brothers, who at the time, quite frankly, there were mosques of other foreign immigrant persuasions that could have hosted him. So I'll just leave that there, and then I'm leaving it open-ended and what that means. The West African reversal is, I think, quite interesting. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and my first Arabic teachers were my parents, but also I studied with Senegalese sheikhs, and I studied in West Africa. And so this is interesting, is I think you have also this interesting connection of real and or perceived African-American Muslims who have wanted to connect back to their roots. I mean, thanks to Ancestry.com and 23andMe, you know, people are able to trace their roots and see some level of identity, some with Muslim heritage, some not. But prior to that great technological innovation with these tools, you know, I think a lot of the West African connection has been in the form of heavy engagement of West African Sufi orders. New York City and, you know, large metropolitan areas have been hugely influential in terms of their ability and connection. And I think that you see, I mean, right, if you go to Senegal as being sort of one example of having studied there, Dakar has African-American communities and have had a regular relationship sending African-American students from America and studying in Medina Kaolack, studying in Chess, various cities in Senegal, West Africa. So I think there's that reversal. There are, you know, various personalities. Imam W.D. is one, Sheikh Haroun Faye is another. There are many various West African Islamic thinkers and religious leaders who have had some influence. But the question is there a regular engagement? I think it depends on the community, it depends on the individual. I wouldn't say there's formal alliances, but I think it's more informal. And you know, from my own experience too as well, having studied in traditional Islamic institutions beyond, you know, academic, Western ones too as well, I think that's what I would highlight.
Hi, Steve Lipson. Could you give any examples of how W.D. Mohammed has used ijtihad for an American context? And also, are there, like, even in a localized area, are there examples of how, like, the African American Islamic community has influenced immigrant communities in the United States?
Sure.
And I think we need an explanation of ijtihad.
Yeah. So just again, independent thinking, independent analytical reasoning. Ijtihad, we know that to deduce Islamic thought in about 30 seconds or 5 seconds, which is hard and complicated. I think a lot of the Shia traditions in Islam have encouraged the gates of independent thinking. That's not taking away the Quran and Sunnah, but it's saying using your rational thought, your mind, that you can negotiate a bit with time and space. I'm giving generalizations, so bear with me on that, and I would explain more in person, point to point. But I think the Sunni traditions have had a, you know, maybe a different approach as a whole compared to the Shia religious community brothers and sisters. So just want to tee up that and frame that conversation. I think that W.D. Muhammad's perspective is, I mean, deciding to pick up the American flag and saying there's this idea of, in Arabic, hibbul watani min iman, the love of country is part of faith. The idea to champion both being in the state, being in the US, and being part of the fabric is part of that independent thinking. You know, there's a wonderful book called Minority Fiqh by the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. I happened to be in Israel at the time, and we were talking, and he interviewed various Islamic judges, qadis throughout the world, and one of the things he said is, you know, I was talking to this one, you know, one particular very well-known, I won't say the name of, Islamic jurist, and he said that, you know, technically if you're in the West, you could be in a perpetual state of minority fiqh status, meaning you can shorten all your prayers. Now, what W.D. Muhammad is highlighting, and I only bring that context up to just say that what W.D. Muhammad highlighted is say, guess what? There is no other place to go to. This is the homeland. That the homeland, in fact, is America, and we must find a way to root ourselves in this society, in these conditions. And he brings up various instances to say, you know, looking and through various accounts of the desire to look for assistance throughout the Islamic world, and when they needed them the most, they weren't able to get that. And so I think there was, and this is probably in the 60s, and reconciling through that. And I think really 75 is, and this is my analytical position on it, is that W.D. Muhammad was really not only coming into position of power, but also it was sealing maybe his positions that, should I step out? Should I not? Should I be this American Muslim? Should I push for this American independence? Should I encourage them to join the armed forces? I mean, Imam Talib Sharif is a former, member of the Air Force and a former NSA Arabic linguist in the mosque of one of the oldest mosques in Washington, D.C. That's taking some courage and some positions that I think other communities might be a bit reticent, maybe a bit hesitant, and they have been on that. And I think that there's some cues to be taken from that, right? And every community might not take it in that posture. The African-American Muslim expression is one of, I think, radically resisting, radically providing a renewal, and then also offering independence. And I think that right there is part of that, I think that ijtihad, and then the community itself.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed, thanks for highlighting this picture, and sort of in line with your previous comment, I'm wondering if you could give a sense of how do you think Imam Muhammad's message, since he died in 2008, this picture is from 1997, I guess. It was controversial. So, I'm sorry, what did I say? 77, I'm sorry. 77. In 2008, he died at an interesting time, right when Barack Obama was elected. How do you think Imam Muhammad's sort of stance on America, even symbolized by this picture, is received or is being received today? In light of, I'll just throw out things like Colin Kaepernick and a lot of the controversy and tensions that we have about identity today.
I mean, I think Imam W.D. Muhammad took a position. It wasn't an easy position. He took a position at the time, and you can imagine other Black Muslims at the time, or African American Muslims. This terminology gets played back and forth, but let's just use African American Muslims were criticizing his position of picking up the American flag. Why? Because it's like, why would you do this in all the history of America and what it has been? And as I highlighted, I think that, he recognized that and was very explicit to say, guess what? I understand that, fair critique, but channel your energy and frustration within the legal processes as well. And do it in a way where it can be constructive, and take it to the ballot, take it to not the bullet anymore, right? The shift, if you will, from the historical Nation of Islam, take it to the ballot and be involved in active civic participation. I think that, with President Obama coming into to power, it's very interesting that, and also W.D. Mohammed being in Chicago too as well. And I think there was some passing engagement with each other too as well. So at least they knew one another when he was then senator. I think, for me, it's interesting of where things will go. And I think maybe that's what I'm always looking for, future analysis, David, future analytical thinking, as well. Like, where does this go next? I think on one sense, there has been a slow erasure of Black Islam or African-American Islam. I mean, I think publicly speaking, I think on the networks who's being called on, they're not African-American Muslims in terms of commentators and issues on these issues. And I think it's others from different ancestral background, which is nothing wrong per se with that. But I think that just looking at the history, it's this constant narrative of African-American Muslims having to constantly reclaim or say, hey, we're here, acknowledge our presence. I think also too as well, the community, and I always like to look at, areas of challenges too as well. The community also is getting older too as well. I think the community is as a crossing point of individuals who made that transition, and then the next generation who are millennials, and that generation after millennials, which I can't remember. And I say that just because those generations, the convert culture, revert culture, however you want to frame it, is no longer the same that we remember hearing about of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. As I mentioned, the Latino community is the fastest growing Muslim community in the US. The socioeconomic dynamics are changing in terms of people who are converting to Islam. Also, the fact of people are leaving religion too as well. I think that's important to highlight, and American Muslims are no exception. African American Muslims are no exception too as well. How does that play out? What happens to these mosques throughout the United States who have that legacy community, but who are maybe struggling to stay afloat? How do they keep these institutions alive? I always like to look at, where that will go. I think these are real questions that I didn't highlight. I didn't highlight that part in the book, but I think those are things that the community will have to address and will have to articulate in some shape or fashion. I'll lastly just say that the current discourse, when we think about African American Islam now, Muslims, it is largely in the form of certainly Dave Chappelle, but I think when you go to urban communities throughout the US, if you go to Philadelphia, for example, Philadelphia, East Orange, New Jersey, this is bastions of Salafi Islam. And Salafi Islam isn't extremist Islam. Salafi Islam is just conservative Islam. So if you go there and the culture, the subculture is very much vibrant throughout the United States. African American Muslims are converting to more, I think, as a whole, a more orthodoxy that is not in line with the legacy of the Imam W.D. Mohammed. Where that goes is a question.
It's going to sound like maybe a pun somewhat, but I've seen you on TV in France, as well as in the islands. And I think you or one of you just mentioned that oftentimes African Americans are not called on CNN and other channels here in the United States for commentary as issues unfold, dealing with extremism and what have you. Has any of the channels like CNN or MSNBC, any of them approach you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I periodically appear on these various shows for sure. I get called regularly on these various outlets, so I absolutely engage with them. And I think particularly with the work with the balance of both Quilliam and then certainly as it relates to the counter-extremism work, that expertise is called on, and others too as well. I think that's important.
Brother Mohammed, it's a pleasure to see you. I wonder if you might speak, building on a previous question, I suppose, to how W.D. Mohammed understood the role of race and or anti-racism in the formation and development of an Islam that was indigenous to the United States, and also how that.
Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Matt Burkhold. I'm the executive director of Visionary Organizing Lab. So this role of racism and/or anti-racism in the formation or articulation of Islam indigenous to the United States. And I wonder if you might speak to the ways in which that contrasted with the Islam of his father.
It's an excellent question. You know, the terminology that was used, right? Both visual and the cultural aesthetic. The community went through various evolutions of names. The reference of Bilal, this iconic figure in Islamic history, was a name given to the community, right? We are Bilalians. Who's Bilal? Bilal is this African figure who's a companion of Muhammad the Prophet, who went through very difficult times. He was tortured, he was beaten, etc. And so W.D. Muhammad using Bilal's story as a means to say, this is the story of you in the American South and chattel slavery, as a form to connect their condition and the experience of Bilal ibn Rabah, who was a close companion of Muhammad the Prophet. And using this, hey, you are Bilalians, encouraging his students when they did travel to Syria, visiting the tomb and shrine of where Bilal was buried, at least from many accounts being in Syria. So I think that this idea of trying to connect the African history and then the journey into the New World, or as he would have used in various settings, in the wildernesses of North America. This is part of the language that was captured as to conjure up a spirit of African identity, but also being in the U.S. context. Lastly, I'll just say too as well, his use of the terminology New Africa also was part of that language, trying to mobilize the community to say, we are no longer in Africa, and though we recognize our experience being in Africa, we are a new people in the new world, and therefore we have to establish a new Africa, a new way of being, which requires us to adapt to the local context. And so throughout the United States, I think there were various communities that were exploring with the idea, and even now, and I think with New Africa communities, there's a community down in Mississippi. The Washington Post did a really interesting write-up about 3 years ago called New Medina, building off of that New Africa concept and ideas too as well. So I think, you know, W.D. Muhammad was trying to find a way to, how do we balance between this African cultural identity for a people who were stripped and looking for meaning and purpose, and then also a way forward, recognizing the past has already been closed, but charting them toward a new future.
Mohammed, unless there's any other comments or questions.
Just a real quick question. You know, as someone that is learning more about history and the experiences of communities, how do you find the importance of American Civil War and slavery to our understanding of current events?
I'll give the short answer because I see we're pressed for time. Yeah, it's a big question. But
and in that, where do we begin?
Yeah, I mean,
so many of us are lost in that shuffle.
Absolutely. I think connected to the book, you know, one of the things W.D. Muhammad encouraged his students was threefold. One, he said, study the rise and fall of Islamic civilization, what went right, what went wrong. Secondly, study U.S. and African-American history. And lastly, study your own story. And I think that that's quite interesting for the community as they were trying to find new means to being this community in the United States, and also trying to be very constructive of what went right and what went wrong. And I think that's I think I would use that just as a means to just, you know, as we all try to find where to look at these issues, that might be something to consider, at least from connecting it to the book.
Well, let's give a round of applause to Mohammed. Congratulations on the book.